And we have three very experienced parents on the panel this morning, and that's Christine, Jane, and Minity. Hi, Jane. I've just seen you there, and Christine. And we also have Anne joining us, Anne Breaks. So for people who don't know, Anne is a consultant speech and language therapist at the Evelina Children's Hospital. And Anne has a strong interest in and research background in blended diet. So it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say, Anne. So thank you for being here as well. At this point, I would like to welcome my fellow hosts, Beth and Abigail, Beth of Reverse Rett and Abigail of Rett UK, and ask them to introduce themselves, starting with you, Abigail.
Right, so hi, Rachel's already said that I work for Rett UK, and I'm also a parent to an 11-year-old with Rett syndrome. So she doesn't need a blended diet at this point, but I'm sure I will still find out more and more about nutrition and in Rett syndrome specifically. So yeah, that's me. I work on the communication and education team for Rett UK, and I've just started a PhD in education as well.
Hi, I'm Beth. I'm from Reverse Rett, events and outreach lead, and joint co-host of our Bitesize sessions with Rachel. I have a 14-year-old with Rett syndrome, also currently not in need of blended diet, and a big food lover, but it's something that I've always been quite interested in, as you know, something that we might need to think about in the future. I'm really interested to hear what people's experiences are this morning. So I was going to go back to Rachel, but I guess we could go straight into asking our panelists to introduce themselves very briefly as well. Just, you know, where you are, who your daughter is, or where your input to blended diet has come from. And we will start with Jane.
Hi, I'm Jane. I am mum to Emily, who is 24 next month, and we've been doing a blended diet for quite a number of years now. We started when she was 18, so but prior to that she was peg fed for quite a number of years due to an unsafe swallow, so that was our sort of route in, but it's been a blended diet with the occasional formula for a lot of years now. We live in East Yorkshire, if the accent didn't give it away.
Thank you, Jane. Over to Christine. I'm just going around the order I can see you in on my screen.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, so I'm Christine. I'm mum to Neve, who's 14, and we've been doing blended diet for about 9 years. Very, very brief history. She had a feeding tube when she was 4, and then she had a fund duplication, and then due to complications we ended up going down the blended diet pathway. Just to let you know, Beth, sorry, I have got a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation. It's not boring, I promise you. It's got pictures in it. So just to let you know, I know I was asked to kind of to bring that along, so I've got that, just so people have got the heads up. Thank you.
Yeah. Over to Minity.
Hi there. So my daughter, she's 10 years old. Her name is Tara. We live in North London, and I think Tara had a peg put in when she was about 6 or 7. It feels like ages ago. So yeah, our story started off with her being on the formula feed, which unfortunately didn't work very well for us. She was rather sick on that. She hated it, we hated it, and then we kind of like researched on this blended food, and we kind of secretly went away with our, starting on simple stuff, and then eventually I wanted to introduce it to her school feeding. It was a bit of a battle at the time, but now she does get blended food at school, so she's been having that for a number of years now. It's hard work. it is hard work. I won't try to sugarcoat it. It is hard work trying to do it, but I'm glad we've taken the decision. It's much better to have Tara being comfortable than being sick like she was when she was formula fed. Yeah, I just hope that's an overview. I'll go into more detail if anybody wants any more detail.
Yeah, no, we will definitely want more detail. We will come back to all of you for more detail. Anne, would you like to just introduce yourself and give us a bit of background?
Yes, yeah, indeed. So yes, I'm Anne Breaks. I'm a speech and language therapist at the Evelina, and I did my PhD was looking at why parents were opting to use blended diet, basically. And I mean, your stories are all so familiar, the sort of the secrecy and the vomiting with formula and things like that. And so that's kind of where my background with blended diet goes. I think probably my PhD was almost triggered by a conversation I had with a parent who was saying, you know, I worked at that stage very closely with dietitians, and they were saying, you know, can I just tell you something, but promise you won't tell the dietitian. It was, I just thought this is so wrong that, you know, parents are having to have this added burden for them of trying to have this, you know, secretiveness and sort of probably feeling very guilty about it as well. So I think that was the trigger. So it was very much with parents that I in mind, and certainly a couple of people with my PhD were saying, well, why don't you interview professionals as well? And I said, yeah, I could, but actually I want it to be very much about parents. And I think parents are the ones who haven't had a voice so much of the time. Hopefully things are changing. I know the British Dietetic Association are beginning to sort of review their policy around blended diet, but it'd be interesting to see other people's experience as to how it is in reality, sort of out there, going to hospitals, going to schools, respite, and all that kind of thing. So yeah, interested to learn from your parents as well.
Thank you, Anne. I think it's really valuable to have a professional perspective here today. So that's going to be very interesting. So before we get started on the session properly, I just wanted to, for those of you who have joined previous sessions, the format today is just a little bit different. So rather than move around our panelists quite quickly for small sections of their experience, we're going to spend a little bit longer on each person. Christine's actually got, as she mentioned, a PowerPoint presentation that I believe she has developed and has been invited to show at her local hospital, and I think also in schools, kind of as a culmination of the wealth of experience that she's built up through Neve's experience. So Christine's going to share that with us, and then we'll obviously open up to questions and ask our other panelists to kind of comment and reflect on Christine's experience before we move on to theirs individually. Please also do feel free to put questions into the chat box or comments as we go along. If you'd rather do that than stick your hand up virtually or literally. So Christine, hopefully you'll be set up to share your screen whenever you need to.
Yeah, I'm just gonna, yeah, that's great, thank you. I just had to move it to a different room because I think it was my internet signal earlier on. Everyone kept on pausing. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Smashing, okay. Right, so I'm going to share my screen a little bit, but I thought I'd just kind of just keep my face on the screen for a couple of minutes. I just want to give a very kind of a bit of a kind of background history really before I start the presentation. So my daughter's Neve, she's 14. She had a feeding tube inserted when she was about 4 years old because she was struggling to feed. She had an unsafe swallow. Unfortunately, every time Neve became physically unwell with a chest infection, she would vomit, and then the vomit would cause a serious aspiration risk. So she had to have a fund duplication. She was on a formula when we first got the feeding tube in situ, and she seemed to tolerate it. It wasn't an issue. But then pretty much overnight after the fund duplication, she started having tolerance issues. It literally happened overnight. She started retching. The retching just continued even with the smallest amounts of formula. We did attempt to seek support from the dietitian, but I think at that point, you know, there wasn't much that they could offer. We ended up taking her to A&E on multiple occasions because she was just losing weight. And what A&E doctors prescribed us was basically a sedative to sedate Neve to try and control the retching. And to me as a parent, that just wasn't an option. That wasn't an option to continue. So that's when I started doing a little bit of research. I started researching about Rett and post-fund duplication. I came across this American article that talked about blended diet. I had heard about blended diet, but I wasn't too familiar with it and what it meant. So I just started doing loads of research, and blended diet just kept on coming up. And then I thought, right, we'll just give it a go. At this point, we're kind of at our wit's end. How I started was Neve was prescribed so many calories with a formula. So I matched that calorie intake with real food, and I used like an app. I think it was Sparks People at the time. I used an app to kind of break down the calories and the macronutrients and the micronutrients, and just, it was, night after night, just spending loads of hours just trying to input meals, getting the right macros right, in the right micros, and getting the right amount of calories. So that's kind of our story, really. So what I'll do is I'll start the presentation. Just as a bit of a just to add, really, though, I do think formula has its place in medicine, but I think it's also important that parents have a choice. And with information, I think about alternatives, I think parents can make an informed choice. So let's have a go at doing this. I'm not that familiar with Zoom because I tend to use Teams, so I'm going to have a go at this. Hopefully
it's much easier than Teams.
If you know what you're doing.
And we've got Wesley here to back us up. Okay, you've done it. There you go.
Okay. Right. Hopefully I can everyone see that? Okay. Smashing. Right. Okay. So this is the presentation that I did for our local hospital a couple of years ago, and I've just changed the title. Right. So this is my daughter Neve. This was a couple of years ago when she first started school, secondary school. She's now 14. As you can see, she's a happy little chappy with her all in purple there. That wasn't planned, by the way. That was pretty good, wasn't it? So just thinking about a typical day of meals and water for Neve. So a total calorie intake is approximately 1,200 calories. That doesn't sound much, but Neve doesn't tend to move much, and she's sustained her weight. She hasn't lost any weight. So just give some kind of real examples. This is what Neve has for breakfast. Granola, fruit, and coconut oil and milk, and the bowl on the right hand side just shows what it's like. And then we cook the granola is already cooked, but if we're having porridge, we mix it up with porridge, and the porridge will be cooked. But that's all put into a blender, and we blend it down. Lunch and tea, that we tend to use either chicken based, fish based, or vegetable based. And these, what we tend to do is we tend to batch blend. So we've got a Vitamix, which I'll go on to later on. Vitamix is a high powered blender, but we basically make a really large batch, and then we pour it into measured bottles. We know exactly how many calories in each bottle, and then we freeze them. And then if we want to defrost them, we just put them in the fridge overnight to defrost, and then we can just heat them up. If we're syringing it, we just let it cool to room temperature, or we can just put it through the feeding pump. We've actually got a dedicated fridge now for all of Neve's blends, which is just a lot easier. She also has a snack later on in the afternoon. That's usually the same as a breakfast blend. So blueberries, fruit and granola. And she also has water. I think water is really important. I think despite her being on a blended diet and having fluids added to our meals, I think it's still really important that we remember to give our kids or our children plenty of water. So this is just a picture of us batch blending. My mum and dad, who we employ as carers, they actually do Neve's batch blending, which is terrific because it takes a bit of the pressure off us. So they do this. So we know how many calories are in each jug, because what we do is we calculate the calories in all of the foods. We weigh it out. So in Neve's case, it's generally 1 calorie per 1 meal. And then so you can see where the marker pen is on the jug. We know that if there's 300 mils in there, there's 300 calories. So these are the types of equipment that we use. So you can see our Vitamix. There are other brands of high-powered blenders, but you know, I think BlendTech is the other one that some people use. We use Vitamix. They are expensive, but I think, in all honesty, I think if you're going to embark on the blended diet journey, you need to invest in a high-powered blender, because otherwise, it will become very, very difficult in using a less powered blender and having to sieve things. It just becomes a bit of a pain. So we've obviously got the pans there, we've got the funnel, we use the funnel, we've got the weighing scales. Weighing scales are really, really important when you first start off, because you need to kind of get a bit of an idea of the calories that you're using. So this is us preparing the containers for the meals. You might recognize these bottles. We get them from our dietitian, and we don't get much stock from the plastics, but it's because obviously Neve isn't on formula, but we do get the plastic bottles, which are really, really useful. So what we do is we just mark up on how many mils she's having. We know again it's 1 mil per 1 calorie, and then we just make sure that each bottle is labelled, so we know exactly what she's on. So as you can see there on the right hand side, we've got a selection of beef, non-meat, and then chicken. And this is just an example of what we do. So we weigh out all the ingredients according to the recipes, and again, it's just so that when you first start, and I think it's really important that you get an idea of how many calories you're actually putting in. I think after time, once you do it, you can just guess it. You can just kind of use your eye. You become so used to the amounts, but I think when you're first starting off, I think it's really important to start to weigh things like sweet potatoes. We just leave the skins on. I think there is nutrition from the skins. Obviously we cook the lentils, but this is just one example of one of the meals that we do, which is a veggie meal. What we do is we add to get the extra calories in, we add almonds, ground almonds. Ground almonds have got loads of calories in them, and we kind of, as you do a bit more research into blended diet, it becomes a bit of a fine art finding high calorie foods but low volume. So dried things like sultanas, they're quite calorific as well. Okay, so this is just preparing your ingredients, washing, chopping and cooking. That's quite obvious really, but again, just some pictures really to show that. Okay, so when the ingredients are cooked, add all the ingredients to your blender jug. If you're making a few jugs of feed, you will need to divide your ingredients up equally into even batches. You may wish to use the weighing scales to ensure an accurate and equal amount. Again, it's just making sure that you're knowing how many calories are in each batch. That's really important. So once the ingredients are in the jug, you add enough boiling water or other liquids. We use water, but you can use other liquids to gain the desired consistency. And we go for a thick batter-like consistency for pumping via the feeding tube. We do use the feeding tube with Neve because, well, for various reasons actually. Sometimes we'll syringe. So in the morning we'll tend to syringe her breakfast, but if we're out and about in the day or if she's at school, it's easier just to feed via the feeding pump. I know that the feeding pump companies don't advocate blended diet through the feeding pump, but at the end of the day, we choose to do what we feel is best for Neve. If you do plunge, you might want to use less water, and I suppose that's a positive. I'll come back. I do actually have a positive and negative list about plunging and feeding via a feeding pump, but I think if you are plunging, you can add less water, and that obviously makes it more calorie dense. So turn the blender on and blend for 2 to 3 minutes. A high powered blender will blend very quickly. A lower powered blender may need longer, but the blend should be silky smooth without any lumps, and that's just to make sure that there's no risk of blockages through the feeding tube. While hot, we then transfer the blended food into a suitable container. We use a funnel, we leave to cool a little, and then we transfer it to the freezer within approximately 30 minutes, and they're frozen. So, to plunge or not to plunge is the question. So there's different way that you can administer blended diet. You can plunge feed, which is just using a 60 ml syringe, or you can use the feeding pump. So I've just there's pros and cons, but what I've done there is just to give a bit of an argument for either side. So plunge feeding enables you to give a more calorie dense feed, less water is required, therefore it's less diluted. There's less equipment that's needed. You don't actually have to use the pump or the feeding, the given sets. It also may be considered more inclusive at meal times. The downside is it might be more difficult to implement at schools. Carers may need more detailed instructions on the speed of plunging. So pump feeding, it's less time consuming for the carer. They've got more controlled speed. It can be given at slower speeds. Generally, it's more accepted by schools and hospitals, and it might be easier to introduce. The downside is more water or liquids are required to thin the consistency down enough for it to pump. This dilutes the blends and obviously creates a larger volume with less calories. So these are just a picture of the different food blenders that I kind of Googled. The Vitamix, I know within the blended diet community is really quite popular along with the blend tech. Then you've got the other ones like NutriBullets and the Tefal. There's lots of other blenders you can use. We've had, I mean, when we first started with blended diet, I think we had the NutriBullet. We went through quite a few lower powered blenders, and they just give up after a while. So that's why we invested in the Vitamix. And we've had our Vitamix for 9 years now, and it's still going strong. So it's worth the investment. Holidays, this is something that I get asked about. Trips out, holidays, how do you manage a blended diet? Well, we have become really quite creative with this over the years. So on the right hand corner you will see our dehydrator, and there's a funny story behind this, because basically what we do is the blend is, as you can see, it's quite a silky smooth. We just put it on the tray, and then we set it to dehydrate over about 7 to 10 hours, and then it kind of goes like I suppose like a beef jerky kind of texture, like a leathery type thing. And then we then blitz it, so it goes into a powder form, and underneath in the little bags, that's the powdered form. So that's basically dehydrated meals. Now, we've been stopped at the airport quite a few times with this. You can probably understand why. And we have been asked to taste it, and it's been through testing. But yeah, so that is what the dehydrated meals look like. And we've been across to Mallorca several times, and we've used this method of feeding because it makes it so much easier. Yes, we could take the blender with us, but I think when you're on holiday, you just, I think for us anyway, personally for us, I think one of the things is just trying to relax and spend time with the kids and not having to worry about preparing meals. So that's something that I think, some parents do opt for. Other options you can think of is just things like, your canned soups or your canned foods that are easy to take with you, and also the Ella's kitchen pouches. We've used them before as well. Just stick it in your bag. They're pretty easy. You just got to make sure that you get the right age, which is just to make sure that it's very, very smooth, because you don't want any bits, because the bits will not go through your tube. And in the top left-hand corner, you've just got some pre-filled syringes. So we don't generally do that, but we do have friends who do that. So they'll maybe, if we're going out for a day somewhere, they'll maybe blend like a sandwich up with some fruit, and then they'll pre-load that into a syringe. It's generally vegetarian, so they don't have to worry about any meat being in it, trying to keep that cool or anything. So they're your options, really. That's some of the options. Of course, you can take your blender as well. So these are just some apps for working out nutritional values. MyFitnessPal is pretty good. NutriCheck, I've actually just recently switched to NutriCheck, not for counting these calories, but counting my own calories to try and lose some weight. And I'm fine. I'm really liking it. I think you pay £20 a year but I really like it. It's very visual. You've got pictures, and that's what I like. I'm a visual learner, so it works for me. But there's lots of different apps out there. The MyFitnessPal one's free. There's lots of other apps, but I do think that it's really, really good if you can use an app just to get some accurate calorie counting. So just thinking about blenders, you can apply to get a blender from charity. The Chronicle Sunshine Fund, that's a local one to us, so that probably wouldn't be appropriate for the rest of people here. But New Life Family Fund, Variety, Cordwell Children, these are all charities that people can use to apply for a blender, because they are expensive. But I wouldn't let the expense put you off. I think if you are keen on going down that route, I think, apply to a charity and you'll probably get it funded. And there's also the option of getting a reconditioned Vitamix at a cheaper price. So that's also an option. You can go on the Vitamix website. And I also think John Lewis, I think they do reconditioned Vitamixes as well. So it's worthwhile. And Vitamixes are really good. They are really, really good. They last a long, long time. So I wouldn't have any problems about getting a reconditioned one. Okay, yes. Me giving advice to my special needs parents, even though I'm not sure what the hell's going on myself. Yeah. So when I was a bit anxious when Beth and Rachel kind of introduced us as the experts. I'm not an expert, I'm expert by experience perhaps, but but I'm not an expert. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, really, of blended diet. I think what I wanted to do is I wanted to give a real practical PowerPoint of what it entails. But I probably missed lots of things out, and there's maybe lots of questions. So if anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say I think that was a really brilliant overview of blended diet, because it gave everybody the visual of what it actually is, and on a practical level what it looks like, which I think was really helpful. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I agree. As a parent who's not had to do it, but is quite daunted by it, like maybe we will have to one day. It was seeing it in very practical terms. I mean, it looks to me like almost a full-time job, at least to start with. I mean, how, and any parent on the panel, feel free to answer this, but how do you kind of work the logistics of having to prepare those meals into your life, particularly in the beginning, when you really are having to weigh everything, and particularly if you've got other children and you're cooking meals for other children as well, and then having to kind of balance the logistics of that?
I think for me, it's batch blending. Batch blending is the key for us. I think spending perhaps a day every fortnight, well, probably not even a day, you're talking about 3 or 4 hours once a fortnight, and just doing a massive batch blend. I think it's about just being organized. It's about knowing what ingredients you need beforehand, getting them in, weighing them out. As I said, the more that you do it, we've been doing it for about 9 years. The more you do it, the more experienced you become, and you know what volumes you need without weighing them. But I think probably for the first couple of months, I think you do need to weigh them. But I'd say I think batch blending for us has been the key. And I think also getting my parents involved, and they wanted to do something to help us practically. So that's one of the things that they help out with. And that's really, really useful.
That's fantastic. I guess.
Yeah, your parents sound really brilliant.
Yeah, I could do with a couple of those. Does anyone else? I mean, I don't want to ask. I've got lots of questions, but has anyone else got questions? I guess one of my main questions is really how did Neve react, and to Minity and Jane? How have your children reacted to going on to blended diet, and maybe how do they react to seeing other people eating regular, in inverted commas, meals? I know for me, Hannah is massively motivated by food. It's one of her biggest joys. she loves it, and she gets quite upset if her brothers are eating and she's not, or even if they've got something on their plates that she wants and she's already eaten hers. So I can imagine in our house it could cause a certain level of tension and distress for Hannah, and I just wondered if you've experienced that, or how it's been for the girls.
I haven't experienced that because I suppose in terms of Neve, Neve had problems with her eating very, very young, and she found meal times really distressing. We found meal times really distressing. She just didn't like meal times. So we've never experienced that when Neve's loved her food, and it's been a social thing. I think because of Neve's complexity and I suppose our level of impairment, we've never experienced that. But I think just picking up on the other question about how did Neve respond. I think in terms of physical health, pretty much as soon as we started to introduce blended diet, she tolerated it. We had to build it up. It wasn't just a kind of a quick fix. Realistically, it probably took a couple of years to get her to the volumes that we're at now. But that's because Neve had tolerance issues with the volumes that she had. So, but going from overnight not being able to feed her because she was retching on formula to then switching it to blended diet and just slowly increasing the volume, she responded really, really well to that. And I think just physically she seems a lot better. She's, her skin's brighter, hair and her nails are growing. She doesn't seem to have that kind of sickly pallor look that she did before. This is not about I think formula does have its place, but I think it's just these are the things that we've noticed in Neve. But the other parents might be able to kind of answer the question about how the girls responded.
Hi, so is it okay?
Yeah, please.
So with us, Tara had reflux issues, so she did like her food, but it got to the point where she wasn't being able to just hold it down as such, and so over time her weight went quite down, and that's when we went down the route of getting a peg done, etc. Now by the way, Christine, that was an amazing presentation. And I'm like, yeah. Now with we did exactly the same. Like we went around weighing the ingredients, initially, especially the dietitian wanting to know that Tara's still getting all her calories, etc. So it's important to go through that method. And after a while, it, like Christine said, it does become easier when you're doing it day in, day out. You don't have to be weighing every single ingredient out. You can just say, yeah, a bit of that, it works well. The issue that we had was Tara is she doesn't have an unsafe swallow. She her food just has to be mashed up a bit, but she does eat orally, but it has to be topped up with the blended food. Now that makes it tricky in terms of sometimes knowing, well, how much blended food do we give her? So we also do have the batch processing because it is really necessary, because you can't be doing this. It does make it easy, but so we do batch process, and we have that for school, so that school always give a fixed amount of blended food through her system. But for home, what we've started doing for a while now is we plate up all her ingredients. So pretty much the dinner that we're having, I'd put it in a bowl thinking this is how much Tara should be having, or a person her age should be having, plus a little bit more because she is underweight. And then we kind of we mash it up with the blender. So we're not looking for puree, but just a little bit mashed up, and we feed it to her as much as she can have orally. Some days she is a great eater, some days no, I'm not having it at all for whatever reason. And then the rest goes back into the blender with a bit of maybe a bit more extra like olive oil or coconut oil, just to boost up the calories in there. And then we try blending it. We would add some milk to it. We've been told not to use water, so milk, get it down to a consistency that's thin enough to go down the syringe, and we give that. And that works well, because with the frozen ones, it is very time consuming having to defrost it and then having to cool it down, and it works well if you got the time to do that. But some days we are just rushing around like headless chicken, and in those days, you know, we just don't have the time to do that. So we do that method where it's leftover food getting blended, so we don't have to worry about cooling it down, etc. And some days we'll just use an Ellis pouch. Right, so we'd get that, and we will put some extra, Ellis pouches, they don't have many calories because they're for babies, not for girls or in an older age. So I'll add on rice powder, I'll add on stuff that can be easily blitzed up without much effort. So that's what we do. I did want to say another thing. With Tara, she really has benefited from blended food. And it worked well for her. But then over the past year, we did notice that something else was bugging her. It's always something with our girls. You think you've got over something and something else crops up. And in a nutshell, we realized that she's intolerant to something was causing the problem. We got an intolerance test done, and we found that she was intolerant to cow's milk and eggs and a number of other things, but those were the two main culprits. And obviously she was getting a lot of milk in her blended diet because that's what we were using as the base to blend it up. And eggs, yeah, Tara loves eggs. So unfortunately we had to take that out of her diet, and then having taken those two items out did really improve the situation. As for Tara, how has she been with this blended food? I think it's been a relief for her because she's not vomiting. Which was a problem for her, and it was a problem for us as parents because cleaning up vomit is horrible. It's time consuming and stressful. So Tara's been happy about that. I think what Tara has probably been unhappy about is the when we took out cow's milk and the eggs from her diet, because she was eating orally, and all of a sudden now she's not got that. She's got alternatives, which probably, you know, you can never replace the real thing, but I just hope she's happier. So yeah, I just wanted to add that on top of my bit.
Thank you.
That's also really interesting, Minity. And I wonder if you could answer the questions that are in the chat for us. Abigail, do you want to ask those questions verbally?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Jane's already clarified for me that Plunge is into the feeding tube with a big syringe rather than a pump. But also I'm interested to know how you calculate the right number of calories for that individual. I mean, obviously there's like a baseline that you go with their age for a neurotypical kid and what you'd expect them to be requiring in a day. And obviously things like physical activity levels are going to impact on that demand. But also I know, so my daughter, she's very mobile, but she hyperventilates and breath holds all the time, and I think that in itself, she uses up a lot of calories that way, and obviously she can get dehydrated very, very easily because she's doing that all the time. So I guess you have to take factors like that in. So I guess I'm just interested to know how you figure it out. There must be a bit of trying and testing as well.
I think that was mentioning the I can't remember thinking out the one that measures your calories. That's very important in convincing a dietitian to agree to a blended diet, to know that your child is getting the required volumes. But sometimes we just I guess visually we think, okay, what a child or person of this age should be having, and when we see it visually and we blend it up, then we think, okay, this is what I think is adequate, and if I add any more booster to it, then obviously I'm meeting the needs. But you raised a question about hyperventilation. We're having the issue of my daughter's developed seizures since March, and unfortunately that's taken a toll on her calories as well, because it just uses it up, the thing. And I've had a bit of an issue in time trying to explain to the dietitian that, look, we're doing the best we can, but this seizure is out of my control. And sometimes people think, oh, we can, because it's now through the tube, we can easily just add on an unlimited supply of food down it and, you know, make up for the lost calories. And unfortunately, it doesn't work like that, you know, because my daughter's tummy is pretty small. Her digestive system is still very sluggish. And I can't just continuously pump stuff in. It doesn't work. And as a result, she has lost a bit of weight. And I have been having pressure from the dietitian again. Oh, maybe we should be adding in these formula shakes or whatever. I mean, they come in different forms, but the end result is it's a glucose-filled palm oil, maltodextrin, all of that stuff into thing. And, you know, it is a high calorie thing, but it's not tolerated by my daughter. But yeah, that's a different battle. But I think that is a major thing, you know, when seizures come on or when hyperventilation comes on, we don't have a computer there calculating how many calories have been knocked off our system. And all we can do is just, I guess, weigh them at regular intervals. I mean, I can't do it at home. I can't weigh my daughter. I've got to wait for the school to weigh her because they have the special chair. And I just think that helps us to keep it's like a guide to know whether we, you know, increase or decrease our amounts.
It's interesting that you say that it's a different battle. But what I'm wondering is, I think it helps to talk about that because it explains why people choose to do blended diets in the first place, doesn't it? I mean, basically what we're saying is it's regular food or it's this kind of formula. And so Jane, maybe if you could tell us a bit about what's happened with Emily, and but really beginning with why, and presumably you started to do blended diet for Emily before it was picked up as being more acceptable. Is that right?
Yes, I would say that's the case. And I think our reasons might have been slightly different to a lot of people's. Emily, the issue of missing food was kind of very much in the past for us. Emily went on to a formula feed quite a few years before, and by that point food was just a big struggle for her, and I think it was a relief for her. It was awful for me as a mother to not be able to feed my daughter, but it was a huge relief for her to not have this battle over food, and she'd lost so much weight. So that had been dealt with. We were through that switch to all nutrition via PEG, and Emily was on a formula for quite a few years, and we were reaching the end of her time in sort of the paediatrics service. And we had a review, we had a change of dietitian, and we had a review, and the dietitian said, how long has Emily been on this particular formula? And I said, right from the start, when she was about 10, I think. And she said she shouldn't have been on this formula. It's inappropriate for someone of puberty age and beyond. And there were certain nutritional, sort of quite important nutritional elements that weren't at the amounts that she should have been getting for the age that she was. And that came as a real shock to me. And I'll be honest, I'd never given it a thought. We used the formula. No one had ever suggested that there were alternatives at all. And I went away from that appointment and thought, this could never have happened if Emily had been eating food. It couldn't have happened in the same way, because the problem with a formula and you're giving X number of milliliters of exactly this every day is if it's insufficient, in this case, protein was one of the things. If it's insufficient in protein, it is insufficient every single day. You will not make it back up. Whereas if you're eating foods, one day you might be less than you should have, but another day you might be more, and there's the chance for your body to sort of make some adjustment. And so I went away and looked, and that's when we discovered that certainly in America, lots of people were doing blended diets. And as I say, we were just switching to adult services, and we were blessed with a fantastic dietitian who trained in South Africa, where it's completely normal to give a blended diet. And she was fabulous. She flew in the face of many of her colleagues and fought a lot of battles on our behalf. To help us. I mean, to be honest, it wasn't going to change what we did, but at least we had her on side, and she was brilliant. But because I came at it from that way, my approach to how we how we did a blended diet was maybe a little bit different, and we never did go down the route of there's a meal on a plate and we put it in a blender and make it into a meal for Emily. Hers was very much, it's maybe explains a little bit that I have a husband who's quite sort of analytical and geeky, and so we went at it from a spreadsheet point of view. So so we had a spreadsheet, and I didn't really find things like the MyFitnessPal, etc. I used a nutritional data website that gave me the breakdown for lots of foods, and all the foods that we planned to use went onto our spreadsheet, and I just worked out how many per blend I would use, and we still do that. So we blend every 48 hours, and I make enough to last us the 2 days, which is as long as you can keep them in the fridge without needing to take extra action from a sort of from a contamination and bacterial point of view. So we do that, but I do my batch work sort of ahead of time. So the things that we put into Emily's blends, I will make in large quantities and freeze. So I will do haricot beans or split peas, or I will do meats as well, batch cook. And then I don't know if anyone's come across the Kiddo Fido little silicon, they're little silicon, well no, very large silicon ice cube trays that hold about 80 grams of things with a silicon lid, and I put them into there, so we know that there are about 80 grams of everything, and I take those out and make a blend from those as we go along. And it's time consuming. We can go for a slightly thicker consistency, because I confess I've never tried to put Emily's blends through her pump, but she has 4 meals a day. So and what I tend to do, I remember reading somebody in America talking about don't put things together that would be vile if you ate them together. So that's what we try and do, and we have I tend to put the more or less sweet things. So we have sort of milk and yogurt, fruit and nuts, and those kind of elements in one blend. And we use raw cacao because of its antioxidant properties, and it's also got quite a bit of fat in it. And so she gets like a chocolate blend that is breakfast and supper. And then the other blend that has the meat and the vegetables and all those sorts of things in as her lunch and tea time blend. And it's just a sort of a rolling sort of conveyor belt of what we produce now. But it is time consuming, and one of the things that we came up against in terms of risk assessment, and I have to say not every dietitian that we've had has been as supportive as our first one, is around the risks of preparing blended diets, the risk of contamination, the risk of microbial growth, and all of that sort of thing, and the risk of not getting good nutrition in. And my answer to that has always been, there is an easy way to do this. The easy way is to just accept the formula and get on with it. People who are choosing to do this are choosing to do it because they want the very best for their child. They are unlikely to go at it in a gung-ho manner. I've never come across anybody who isn't really committed to making this work for good reasons. And in terms of benefits, I would just say Emily has a very, very slow gut motility, as do a lot of girls with Rett's. I know problems with constipation probably all her life. And this helps. I can really crank up the fibre content of her meals to what she can tolerate, and what helps with sort of bowel movement as well. So we do add in 1 or 2 things. We use OptiFibre to get extra fibre in, even though, I mean, she is lentil woman, really, honestly. She's got so much fibre in her diet, but we do boost it as well. And I add vitamin D drops, and I add sea kelp tablets, because getting iodine into a blended diet is quite difficult, because we won't do shellfish. I'm just a little bit suspicious about putting shellfish into a blended diet, so we don't tend to do that. But other than that, it is regular food, but I confess her diet is better than ours.
Can I just, I'm really interested by everything that you've said, and I've just got a couple of comments and questions just from a normal parent point of view now. So the first thing is, my daughter has a feeding tube, and she's had it since she was 6, but she doesn't have blended diet. In fact, she's eating orally pretty well at the moment, but she's gone back and forth throughout her life. So when she's had periods where she was quite poor at eating, mainly connected to the breathing problem, because the breathing was just so disrupted, she wasn't getting enough food down her. We did have a situation where virtually every day she was having her food blended and put down. Now, we had formula, but it's after years and years and years of it, and smells so horrible and everything. I just thought, well, people are doing this, and I just looked at the blended diet groups and thought, why not when she's at home? Because we were using, we already had nice meals. Now, this kind of ties into the question that I really have, if I can think of how to form it. I suppose, well, one thing that we were saying before this session started, Abigail and Beth and I, was with what I've noticed about blended diet, people seem to go to a lot of effort to make sure that people are getting the right amount of calories and the right kind of nutrition, to the point of feeding their children things that they probably wouldn't have given them orally, or that most people aren't who are giving their children oral food. Certainly, healthy children, half the time they're having chicken nuggets and I don't know, whatever, and the occasional apple or something. To hear discussion of, yes, obviously it's really good to have the more methodical approach to it, where you have a spreadsheet and you're making sure that you're covering all these different bases as well. But I think it's important to emphasize that shouldn't put people off if you're not that kind of person, because I'm not that kind of person, but we're in our house, we're already vegan, and we, everything's made from scratch. So if it is our leftovers, it's pretty much all right. And I probably wouldn't need to sort of go, okay, exactly what's this doing for Amber, because we're adding it, like all those sort of special things are already getting added into the food. Do you see what I mean?
If I could just come back to that, one of the main reasons that we take a different approach with Emily's feeds is that volume is a real issue. One of the things that I think there's some kind of witchcraft or wizardry goes on at the place that does the formula, because how they can get that amount of calories into that consistency of a formula is totally beyond me, and it has convinced me that it can't be real food.
So explain, just to stop you for a second, for people watching that might not understand totally. By volume, you basically mean, so it's the amount she can tolerate going into her system versus the amount of calories in there. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. That a lot of foods, healthy foods, thicken a blend quite considerably without necessarily adding a huge amount of calories. So for example, we don't tend to put potato and we don't tend to put pasta into a blend, because you have to water it thin it down such a huge amount to get it through, that you're then giving vast quantities of blend just to get the calories in. So for example, I'm not a massive fan of quinoa. It's just one of those things. I don't particularly like it. We don't tend to eat it. Emily has it an awful lot because it's one of the brilliant ways of getting protein and some carbohydrate in, and it's very nutritious without thickening the blend too much. So it's purely practical, but also because I came at it from the point of view of I can do a better job, please, no offense, Anne, I can do a better job than the dietitians have done on this particular issue of, not getting the right nutrients in for a very long time. So I felt for myself, if I was going to do this for Emily, I had to be sure that I was giving her the very best nutrition that I could. And I agree, not everyone has to do that. We do know people who they have whatever they have, and their child gets the same things blended up and they are thriving. It's not
okay, but let me ask you this, because you were saying that most people who do the blended diet don't go at it gung-ho because there's an easy option, which is formula. And what I want to do now is I want to ask Anne, is that really true, or are there people who are blending frozen pizza?
I mean, there are. One thing I was going to say, following on from one thing Jane said, is that without the formulas, I mean, and I asked this question to my dietitian colleagues and my sort of gastroenterology colleagues. We know what's going into the formula, but we still don't know what children are absorbing from it. And we know most children who've got, or a lot of the children and young people who are having blended diet, whatever reason, a lot of them do have gut motility issues and gut absorption issues. So it's great saying, oh, I know exactly what's going into their formula, but we still don't know exactly what they're absorbing. So although we think that, the formula is, or dietitians and a lot of professionals think the formula is, you know exactly what they're having, but you don't know exactly what they're getting out of it. So we still, it's not just because you're having formula, you don't know absolutely everything the child is taking. And we know children on formula can still be losing weight, or, because they're not absorbing all that they need to be doing. So, and also just picking up on the bit about sort of what you're giving them. Certainly I had a family, they didn't have Rett, but they had triplets. They'd all been very premature, and one was very much more poorly than the other two. And the mother just used to say, so I put 3 plates out, put on 3 plates, and just give the one who's on blended diet, maybe add a little bit more sort of coconut oil or something like that. So again, it doesn't always, as you said, Jane, doesn't have to be all that sort of the weighed outness and everything else. And again, I think it's picking up on, I can't remember who said it, but it's that idea that you don't always have the same amount either every day. One day we're feeling that we actually got a bigger appetite than another day, and I don't think it's any different for children who have blended diet. And certainly one parent I spoke to said that their child was actually able to put their hand up or ask for more, or tell them to stop if they felt that they were full. So yeah, it does offer a lot.
That's really interesting. One thing I was thinking about asking when you were talking about the volume issue as well is, my daughter has also recently gone on to like a soft diet level 6 now orally. So everything has to be mashable basically. But I've noticed that when you've changed the consistency of food, she seems to be able to tolerate less of it. Does that make sense? Like she doesn't want to eat as much, because I think maybe I was thinking it's, she's bored of the texture basically. So I'm trying to do things where the tastes are more interesting, and there's a few different things on the plate that are all the same texture maybe, but have different exciting flavors. And but she still seems to be, maybe it's because I've had to add a bit of fluid in, maybe it's making it so there's more, it just looks like more of a pile. Does that make sense? It's hard. It is hard. The whole thing feels quite hard as a parent. I mean, even when she, I don't know, when she first had her feeding tube and we gave her overnight feeds, and you kind of knew, even though she struggled in the day, that at nighttime she would get this complete nutrition through the tube. It felt to me as a relief. And now, as all, we've gone through lots of different experiences with it. I think all of it's quite difficult, because you have this natural instinct to want to feed them in the normal way. And so I think with blended diet, it does give. Do you think, Anne, this is something that parents report as being a big reason that they want to do blended diet, because it feels more like you're giving your child real food?
Yeah, in a word, definitely that was always one of the key reasons, the choice it gave. And I think, and again, I sort of talked a bit in my thesis about this. There's a lot about, in society, there's so much about food in society now, and how many pressures there are, whether it's losing weight or having the perfect figure, or having homemade food is better than processed food. And there's such a lot of burden, if you like, on families to do it right, and people are judged by how they feed. And I think whether families are feeling that or not, it's almost subliminal when you look in the media and everything else. There's lots about food. I think that is a big issue. But I think what we've got to make sure, and I think Jane, you said some people it's formula is fine for them. I think we've got to make sure we don't kind of start vilifying parents if we do start offering blended diet as an option. When a child has to have a gastrostomy, I think we've got to make sure that it's not just blended diet, and if you don't choose blended diet, you're a bad parent. I think there's a lot that can be learned from sort of breastfeeding as well. But I think some of the parents, there's some research with people who decided not to breastfeed, and indeed my own daughter-in-law didn't breastfeed, and actually it wasn't right for her. And I think, you know, you've got to accept choice, and if you're going to give choice, you've got to understand that actually some people won't do what you want or what you think is the right thing. So I think that's very important with blended diet. And also, so I'm picking up with one thing that I think, Christine, you mentioned about the sort of the adding more medicines. I think you'd said at one stage, one of the things that suggested was adding more medicines to counteract something at the beginning of your presentation. And I think that was one of the things I, again, found that a lot of parents, they're not anti-medicines, but they do see formula as a medicine. And, you know, if they've got, I'm sure probably all of your children have some sort of medication. And certainly I found that in my research, virtually about 98% of respondents, their children had some sort of medication. But they absolutely accept it. But I think what we're saying is that formula feed is, you know, it can be deemed as a sort of medication rather than a food. And if you can use food and not medication, I think that's great. And again, we found that some children have, particularly with when they've had medications for things like seizures, in fact, that the fact they're having the blended diet, we're not entirely sure why, but it's perhaps because the absorption is taking longer. They actually need lower levels of medication because it's, you know, the gut is taking longer, the food's in the gut for longer than it is with formula, where it just passes through, so that actually the children actually have more time for the gut to absorb the medication, so they need less of it because it's not passing through with the formula in the same way. So there's a lot of more normal absorption and sort of gut motility going on with the blends.
How is the formula for kind of your gut microbiome?
There's a lot about that as well. I mean, I'm not a dietitian, so I can't say that. There's a lot of questions about that, because, you know, we're saying, again, going back to that sort of food discourse, you know, that the processed food isn't as good for you. Well, you can't get much more processed than formula. So, and, you know, dietitians are saying, you know, have probiotics and things like that. And so I think that is pretty much agreed now that you do need that gut microflora and things like that. I think they're calling it. I say I'm not a dietitian, but there is a lot about that. And yes, you haven't, which I think is probably one of the reasons, although we haven't done enough research to prove that, but I think one of the reasons people are more healthy with it. And, you know, you have the healthier hair and better concentration, all sorts of different benefits of it. So yeah,
it's definitely really encouraging to have a speech therapist who, with your experience obviously, but who has this very positive outlook about blended diet, because I know that it hasn't been everyone's experience.
No.
That, you know, a lot of the time that people will say, I wanted to do blended diet, but they wouldn't, nobody would sign off on it for them to give it to them at school. So I'm going in at lunchtime. And do you still come across that?
Yes,
or is it...
and certainly again, I had a huge number of respondents, which is great, and a lot of the people who were giving mixed, still giving some formula, was because they were actually having to give formula at school. It wasn't they wanted to do both, so it skewed the figures a little bit in my research, and that a lot of people were giving blended as well. But say it might have been because it was in hospital or school or after school club or something like that, where they had to have the formula because they just hadn't got through it. And some people will say it was just a battle they weren't prepared to fight. And you know, I'm sure you know there's so many battles that are being fought, and you think, well, that's one we could probably do without. And but there are still others who are finding, you know, that even just that one formula feed that was really causing their child to have real problems, discomfort and everything. So yeah,
I saw you nodding when Jane mentioned that her very supportive dietitian was trained in South Africa. I saw you nodding with a kind of wry smile. Have you, in your experience, are there in other countries and cultures, is it more widely supported, and would there be any particular reason for that?
One of the reasons, certainly in South Africa, is because it's cheaper to not have the formula, and that was why they're kind of there. There was one piece of research, because I know, again, we've talked about the sort of the problems or potential problems, and certainly some of the potential problems are in fact not as serious as they think. And in terms of blockages, that has always been a big issue about, you know, blockages. But there was one piece of research, I think it was in Poland, and they actually were using not ready-made formula. So they had previously been using blended diets because, again, the cost and things like that. But when they started using formula, which parents had to prepare the formula feed, like with a bit like a baby milk with the powder, that was the only time I found some evidence of tube blockage was actually when the parents were preparing a formula milk. So slightly ironic. But
also, nobody's bothered about blockages when it's medicines blocking the tubes.
And also nobody's bothered about the fact that the tubes aren't registered for putting medicines down either. So it's
very interesting.
There's some very lot of double standards going on, I'm afraid. But yeah,
I think it's interesting as well that you've mentioned a couple of times, Anne, breastfeeding and formula for babies, because during the discussion I've been reminded a few times of, you know, that kind of weaning stage of when you're pureeing, which I personally hate, but when you're pureeing all the baby food. But I wonder if, you know, when Rachel said about you feel more like you're giving your child something, proper food, normal food, and therefore, you know, something that actually as parents we cling on to, but also it's something about them being, you know, children, teenagers, adults, and not babies.
Absolutely, you know, yeah, definitely.
You graduate your baby from formula or from breast milk quickly, and it's a stage of progress. It's a milestone that they're now eating proper food. And actually, I wonder if there's an emotional thing about to go back to a formula is taking your child back. And there are so many things that make you feel that they're not age appropriate. They're not doing things that they ought to be doing for their age. That to take your 14 or 25-year-old back to essentially baby formula feels like quite an emotional backward step, whereas going back to, you know, going to regular food that's given in a slightly different way doesn't feel like quite the same emotional.
And there's one family, again, a totally different issue, but the child, I think he was, I don't know, sort of probably early secondary school, 11, 12, 13, that sort of age, and he'd had difficulties and sort of a degenerative condition, but the mother was saying he very quick, almost in a matter of weeks, lost the ability to walk and talk and eat. And she said that the biggest progress that he made, you know, he didn't recover these things, but actually when she started using blended diet with him, took him to the shops, and he could, you know, she said, do you want your fish fingers or your chicken, or do you want this or that? She said his whole being, when he actually got that choice back, and that almost that's the only thing he really had any control over. And she said his demeanor, he'd become so depressed, and she said, you know, it wasn't the walking that was upsetting him, or the talking, it was the fact he, you know, couldn't really choose anything. And she said it was fantastic and she said they were a very foodie family anyway, she said, so they, you know, they go to coffee shops and things like that. And she said it was just, you know,
choosing food is a very, I mean, I think that even, you know, my daughter can eat, but she doesn't get to choose what she wants every day, because I'm cooking for 4 children and they don't get to individually choose their meals. But probably the boys get more choice about what they might want than she does. And I do think it is, if somebody just told me this is what you're having and that's it, I wouldn't like that very much. And I think it is about independence and choice making and having a voice.
And also in terms of taste, I mean, that was one of the things, I think it was a 17-year-old's mum was saying that he'd, you know, on his 17th birthday or something, or 18th birthday, been to the pub and actually had a beer down his tube, and she said, you know, he liked it, and he wasn't going to get drunk, but he said that other adults in the States who are using blended diet say, you know, you get a bit of, you know, if you have a bit of a burp, not reflux, but, you know, and you get the flavor of whatever you've eaten, whether it be a coffee or wine or something like that. But again, if you've got a sort of the formula, which, you know, as I think somebody said, it doesn't smell particularly great, but if you're getting that as a bit of a burp, it's not particularly pleasant. Whereas actually, if you've had a nice meal or a coffee or a whatever, it's a more pleasant experience. It's not reflux I'm talking about here. It's just that little bit of,
you know, when we were thinking about reasons people wanted to do it, I just all the time think about when, before they had these universal kind of adapter things on the tubes, my daughter's pump used to leak quite a lot. It used to slip out because the thing is so sticky, and just the way it was on the bed, how it becomes congealed in the night, or, you know, if it got stuck in a hair or something. The smell of it, the thought of having that in your system and that alone, and it being what you are, you know, what's the word, you know, not regurgitating, but you can sort of sense what you've been eating. I noticed that Jane and Abigail have your hands up. So Jane, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just see if I can take it down again. I'm still not used to this.
I can do it.
Just wanted to make a couple of points that maybe sort of are around, well, one's definitely around kind of slightly around the politics of it, and it's only a recent discovery for me, but I don't know how much of the country is served by Nutritional Homeward for plastics and the things that support sort of feeding, but I only just recently discovered that the plastics side of things is basically subsidised by the selling of the feed. That and if you get to find out what the cost of one bag of formula is, it is monstrous. It's so expensive, and which is one of the reasons we get a little bit of backlash from, and the dietitian obviously works alongside the nutrition, and we do not get a ton of support for the plastics that we need to provide Emily's blended diet. We basically buy it ourselves because Nutrition are not that keen to support if they're not making money off the formula that they sell. So it's just something to bear in mind in terms of what goes on behind the scenes that we were totally unaware of for a great number of years. That does play a part. And the other thing was just unrelated but kind of practical. We also have the Vitamix, as so many people do. We found Vitamix as a company to be massively supportive of blended diets. We've had one problem, which was a problem with the beaker, the actual jug on ours that came loose at the bottom. And I spoke to somebody at Vitamix and they sent out a new one before they took ours back. So that, and they sent it out, it was with us the next day so that we weren't left without a blender, and they just replaced it free of charge. They have been really supportive of people who are using blended diet for somebody in order to get their full nutrition. So it's kind of useful to know.
Yeah, that is good to know. Abigail, sorry, come to you.
It's okay. I was just going to reiterate really what Anne said about having a tiny bit of autonomy in a life where there's not a huge amount of independence really, and being able to make some choices. And just about the fact that, you know, there is research that's been published out there to say that women with Rett syndrome are at much greater risk of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, that kind of thing. And so I think anything that we can do as parents to try and build that mental well-being, emotional well-being up, even through the tiny things like, do you want chicken or fish or neither of those things, I think can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I really agree with
very
that too. Rob, I know that you're here listening in as always, and I just wondered if you had any questions or comments or any input to the overall.
Not particularly. It's been incredibly interesting. Just listening to everything. It sounds incredibly complex, as it is with all of these things. And our role is obviously to try and just get the feedback and possibly make things easier for people going forward. There's a lot of things running around my mind, but I won't share too much of that, because what we normally do is we take it back, to the team, and then just have a chat with them. But I mean, the the session so far, there's just been an awful lot of advice being given, or at least things that have been shared, and hopefully they're valuable for everybody else that's been on board. I mean, personally, I don't have a child with Rett syndrome, so for me, it's more as an organisation to see what we could possibly help people with.
Well, I think it's been really helpful to have this as a joint session, and so that we can all bear in mind the points that have been raised, and obviously think about them as we're planning things moving forward, but also so that this session can be shared broadly in the Rett community. Has anybody else got any more questions they want to ask? Because I know we're coming towards the end of the session now.
Particularly if anyone's got a question for Christine, who's got to get Neve off to her PCR test, I think that's been incredibly valuable and incredibly practical. I think, sometimes there's a danger of talking about these issues on a very theoretical level, but this has been really, really practical. I think any parents who are watching this later, who are maybe at the start of this journey or considering or come to it even in a few years' time, maybe, it's some very practical, real life advice, which is great. I mean, one thing just to summarize maybe is, from what I've gathered from all of you, is that it's been a very positive thing. So, on reflection, is there anything that you would say to parents who are thinking about it, or parents who are at the start of the journey? What would your reflections be in a nutshell? I'm going to go to Christine because I know she has to go.
Thank you. I'll probably say engage with the dietitian. I think we did try to engage with the dietitian initially, and we didn't get much support, but I think because they could see how much effort we were making, and similarly to Jane, when we did first start off, we used a spreadsheet, but I think, engaging with the dietitian, get them to do as much, to provide as much help as possible, ask them to formulate some recipes, get them to do some hard work, because that's what their speciality is at the end of the day. And I think as parents, we've got enough on our plate, excuse the pun, but yeah, so I think just getting the dietitians involved and try and get their support. I think it's not an easy journey. I think we've got to be honest, it's not an easy journey. I think you've got to be organized, you've got to set time aside. I think there are some politics involved that you've got to be willing to challenge. There's a brilliant Facebook group called Blended Diet UK, which is a fantastic resource. I wish it was around when I first started, and they are great. They give you very, very practical advice about how you can introduce it into schools if you have any problems, lots of practical forms that you can use, like risk assessments. So I think if you are interested, definitely try the Blended Diet UK Facebook group as well.
Thank you, Christine. That's really helpful practical advice, and we wish you all the best of luck for the rest of this week with Neve. I hope it all goes as smoothly as possible. Oh, we can't hear you. What's happened there? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I've muted myself. Yeah, sorry, I will have to go now, but just to say thank you very much. And if anybody wants to reach out or wants any more information, I'm here. Okay, well, I've experienced it. I know what the challenges are. So yeah, if I can be of any help at all, please just reach out. But enjoy the rest of your session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good luck this week.
Thank you very much. Bye. Bye.
Take care. I guess Jane, Minity, or Anne, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that? I'm very conscious of time, but did you have anything that you'd like to add?
I just wanted to add, Beth, I think sometimes, if those starting on blended diet need to just cut themselves some slack. I know it's all very well, you've got pressure from the dietitian to say, oh, is your child meeting the calorie intake or blah, blah, blah. And just think like, if our children didn't have this problem, they'll be eating all sorts of junk food, like someone mentioned, we're actually giving them a healthier food. It might not be the calorie, target, we might not reach that target, but we're giving them such a variety of food that it is good for them, and they're getting lots of vitamins and stuff that they wouldn't have got otherwise. Just take baby steps first. You don't have to worry. When we started, we just started on the snack element first, and then moved on to meals and stuff. So just take baby steps first, and the more you do it, the more I won't say easier, but the more you do it, the more experience you get in doing so, and you feel less nervous about the whole thing. Yep, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful, actually. Give yourself a break. One thing I think is really interesting is the idea that because somebody's on blended diet, their intake is absolutely scrutinized, like you said, in a way that nobody scrutinizes what we feed our kids regularly on a plate. And probably a child, as Christine said, I think Jane said as well, you're going to go at it. If you're the kind of parent who's doing blended diet, you're probably the kind of parent who's going to really work hard to make sure it is fully nutritious and interesting and varied. Whereas, a lot of regular kids just churn out the same food kind of fairly often. It's quite monotonous. It's not necessarily all that. So it's interesting that it gets scrutinized on that different level. Jane and Anne, anything to add before we go?
I will just make just a couple of really basic points that I think are maybe self-evident, but in our case and in a lot of cases, the only thing that had changed for Emily was that she couldn't swallow safely. Nothing else was different. It was the getting the food from outside her body to inside her body that was the issue, not what she needed. It was a very simple, practical issue, and with hindsight, I never questioned at the time, but why does the food that goes in need to be any different just because the method of getting it there has to change, and which maybe sort of demystifies a little bit the notion of giving a blended diet or not. Not that I'm saying it should be right for everybody, but that it's not that complicated a thing. It just requires learning a few new skills. And I did have another point, and I can't remember what it was.
But that was a really good point.
That is a really good point. Yeah.
And it's and I actually just started to write it down because I think it summarizes the point of having the conversation. Which is why do you think about doing blended diet, and why is it beneficial? But I also would like to re-emphasize what I think Anna said earlier about the fact that just because we're having this conversation today doesn't mean that there's any shame in people who do use formula. And I used it for many years with Amber, and it sounds like you did as well, Jane. And sometimes when you've got to look at the whole picture holistically for your family, and not look at it as an issue by itself, what you can manage to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and perhaps it's not the right time or whatever for somebody to embark on this additional piece. We all just have to prioritize the parts that we think are particularly important for our child at the time that they come up, don't we? Because you can't possibly do everything. Although a lot of us try. Anne, would you like to add anything else?
No, I think we've probably covered most of the things, but again, if anyone wants to contact me afterwards, I think Julie's got my email. I think other people probably got my email, but happy to have a chat with anything crops up, or anyone thinks of anything else afterwards, as I invariably do when I'm on different calls, things like that. I wish I'd asked that, but no, and then thank you as parents as well, because it's really helpful to hear experiences and what's going on as well. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Overall, I would say we really appreciate, on behalf of Reverse Rett and Rett UK, we do really appreciate all of the input from everybody today. Christine, Minity, Jane and Anne in particular. Thank you to Abigail for co-hosting this session with Beth and I as well, and to Rett UK for the opportunity for us to do this together. And we will send out a survey to everybody, even if you weren't here at the actual session, for the people that have registered and who watch after. And it's really helpful to us if people can just take a few minutes to fill that out. Also, please keep an eye on the informational events page. It's that Beth, on Eventbrite or on the Reverse Rett website, or both?
It's on the Reverse Rett website, informational events, not the events, the informational events.
Okay.
I can put it in the chat.
And we will also post on social media, but we have a couple more sessions coming up in October, which are joint sessions again with Rett UK for Rett Syndrome Awareness Month. And we will send out the link to this video from this session next week. So thank you very much to everyone for being here, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you,
Minity,
Beth.
didn't cry.